I'd like to tell you a story that will help us to appreciate, maybe I'll even give you two examples to help us appreciate the situation here that we are seeing where the Lord lets us know our present status. And it can apply to any walk in life. I was sitting in my living room chair, and there was company that day in the living room. And I had just sort of put my head back on the chair, and I was just thinking about the things of God and just sort of being very peaceful in His presence. I wasn't really trying to deliberately reach out to receive a word of knowledge, but indeed a word of knowledge was coming. And I saw a placid lake, so still, so extremely still, that the sun was shining down on it, and it just glistened across the water. There wasn't one ripple on the water, no wind of any kind. It just looked like a sheet of glass. And on the water was one of those old stern-wheelers. Beautiful, beautiful boat. They're the old kind, you know, that have the wheels that turn around, and out from behind it ripples the water. And on the water was one of those stern-wheelers. And I just sort of waited on the Lord to see if there was anything else. There was nothing else in the way of any kind of a picture. And the most beautiful peace just seemed to just flood down from the top of my head right down through the tip of my toes. And I just basked in that peace for some time. Then I sat, kind of pulled my head up in the chair, and I spoke to the people that were there, and I said, you know, I don't know what I've received here, but I explained the picture. They said, well, what does it mean? And I said, I really don't know. I just know I've received it, but I don't know what it is. It was a few days following this that I received a word from the general hospital in the city that we were living in, that my daughter was in the hospital and she had been in a car accident that evening. I really felt devastated. They said that it didn't appear that too much was wrong, but that she seemed to be able, that she could get out of the hospital and I could bring her home that night. What had happened was that she and her boyfriend were in the back seat of the car driving, and her girlfriend and her boyfriend were in the front seat, and this girl apparently hadn't known how to drive, and the fellow in the front let her in behind the wheel. And as she was driving the car, she panicked, and instead of putting her foot on the brake, she put her foot on the gas and rammed into a steel pole. The car was completely totaled. And it's amazing that any of them got out alive. The two in the front seat were injured much more than the two in the back. My daughter was hurt in that all that the doctors could feel that was wrong with her was her one leg had been injured on her bone. I was greatly distressed, and the situation was, well, as any parent knows, it's not an easy thing to realize that your child has been in an accident. I went to the hospital, and the doctor said I could bring her home, and I did. And I put her in my bed because I was very concerned about her, and I just wanted to make sure that everything was okay. And when I got up in the morning and went into my kitchen to wash the dishes, and I heard a scream come out of my bedroom. And here she is saying, oh, Mom, come quick, please. And she gets an upset stomach, and she starts to heave. And she says the room is tipping upside down, and she is just, the panic of the whole thing just makes you feel scared. You say, oh my goodness, whatever is wrong? You know, you don't know what's wrong. Anything could be wrong. Well, I phoned the doctor immediately and rushed her to the hospital, and she has now been put in the intensive care ward for a while for examination. I sat in the lobby waiting to see some word, what the doctor might say was wrong with her, to find some kind of peace or comfort. And I put my arms over the back of the chair where I was sitting, and there was a window behind my back, and the sun was coming in the window. And I could feel the warm sun on my back. And I just turned around and looked out of the window like this. And I could hardly believe my eyes. There was the Calgary Glenmore Dam, and the place is surrounding it is a place now where they have what is called Heritage Park. And on that dam was an old stern-wheeler which they use for tourists. And the stern-wheeler was out on top of that dam. The water was placid, placid, placid. not a ripple on the water. The sun was coming down and shining on the water, and the tourists obviously were in the boat going across the dam, and all you could see was the ripples coming out from the back of the sternwheeler. And while I'm sitting there, this great peace floods down over my body. And what was the revelation for? To give me peace, to let me know that everything was going to be okay. In just a few minutes following this, the doctor came out and said, all I believe from what I can find is wrong with your daughter is that her equilibrium has been thrown out of her ear. And it causes a person to feel like the room is tipping upside down and causes the tummy to be upset. And this may happen 1 or 2 more times, but not to worry, she would be okay. Well, believe me, those were very comforting words. But you see, sometimes God gives us a word of knowledge, and we call it a revelation, to help us in a situation where we find it is very difficult for us to handle. And that's a different variety, let's say, of a way here that this was used in the story that we read in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 1 probably through to verse 6, where the wife of Jeroboam came and decided to feign herself as another person, in which case we were reading that on our last seminar. I want to give you another illustration in association again with this portion in 1 Kings chapter 14, verses 1 through to 6. And this to me is an exciting story. I get a real thrill out of this one. Again, it's another variety, a different type of a revelation for a different purpose, and every revelation that is given to us is always unto profit, always unto purpose. I was in Trinidad working with Babsy. We had already gone, I'd say about a week and a half or so into the teaching seminars. We were driving along in the car, and she had been witnessing some of the gifts of the Spirit being exercised, so she was aware of what was taking place. But I asked her a question. I said, Babsy, if you had a little bit of money, what would you do with it in the way of repairs for your house? And she said, well, the windows, first of all, she said, probably could be fixed. People don't know it, but she says the windows are so weak that if a person just pushed in on them, they would push in, you know, and you could come in and rob us blind. Now they've got the windows fixed, so, you know. But I says, well, how much would that cost? Well, I'd say around $300. And I says, no, Babsy, what would you do if you had a larger sum of money? Several $1,000s. And she looked at me, several $1,000s. She says, where would a person get money like that? It doesn't grow on trees. And she was thinking, and before she had a chance to answer me, I said, I know what you could do. You could get that kitchen of yours repaired. That would be the thing to get done. Because I said, you know, the amount of people that come in and out of this place, you have no idea. These people can accommodate one person after another coming in through there. There's the kitchen crew were serving hundreds of people. They'd accommodate them for conferences, and not only that, but she was the type of person that would go out into the highways and bring the underprivileged and the derelicts and these people in and care for them and nurture them, and then the very next day she could be entertaining the Archbishop, you know, this kind of a person. But constantly their house was just a mass of people moving in and out of there. I don't know how they did it, and the quarters themselves were so small. I had to admire these people for the amount of good they did for the whole of the Caribbean. See, you need that kitchen made larger. I said, I would go absolutely stark staring crazy in this kitchen trying to accommodate everybody. Well, she says, nice, Mary, I appreciate your concern, but where are we going to get the money to do it? I says, Babsy, the Lord is going to provide a man with a large sum of money, and this is going to go in to help in the repairs of your house. She turned and she looked at me while she's driving the car, and, you know, kind of an astonished look. And she said her beautiful praise the Lord at me, even though there was that little bit of a question mark, you see, that was seen. And then we just kept right on going. You know, there was no more conversation about it. It just came out of my mouth. I said it, and it was like the thing was already done, so why bother to discuss it any further? It was about the end of the week finishing that particular time of seminar teaching. And I was sitting in the guest house up on top of the Mount St. Benedict. I was staying there, had a quiet, it was a very quiet place, and due to the fact that I was teaching 3 seminars per day, 2 hours each, let me tell you that by the time I came to each day for 7 straight days, you know, I'd be getting a little bit tired and my voice was starting to wear out, so I really didn't want to talk to too many more people at that point. I came into the guest house that night and sat at the table hoping that, you know, I could sit by myself. However, into the room came a man about 6'1", 6'2", and the people often in the West Indies are a mixed blood. I don't really know completely what the mixture of blood in his veins was, but he was part Puerto Rican, a little colored, little French. He had a mixture of blood in him. And he came to the door and he opened it and stood there, and he just stood there staring at me. You know, I'd never seen him before. He wasn't one of the people who were in the seminars. He just stood there staring at me. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable, you know, and finally he came over to me. He says, "You're the one. You're the one." I said, "I'm the one what?" He said, "You're the lady they're talking about down in town." And I says, "Really?" He says, "Yes." He says, "I was in the pub for a while today," and he says, "a whole bunch of fellows were standing there talking about this Canadian woman up at Mount St. Benedict and all of the miracles that God was doing up there." And then he says, "I was in the lawyer's office another time today," and he says, "there were several men in there, and they were talking about this Canadian woman up at Mount St. Benedict and all the things that were going on." And then he says, "I was over at the racetrack," and he says, "there were some more people talking about what God was doing up there on the Mount." He says, "You're the one. I know you are." I says, "Well, it's highly possible. I don't know." I said, "I know God is doing some wonderful things up here for sure." He says, "Do you mind if I join you?" Well, all right. Now, while I sit there eating my supper, he starts to pour out the story of his life. I tell you, my heart was so touched. I felt like my heart was going to twist in two as he told me the story of his life. You know, sometimes a person has to be a good listener, and I was glad that in this case I had talked myself out just so that I could listen. He said, "You know, when I was a child, about a youngster, and then he said I grew up to be about 15 years old and I was in school. And he said I did something that, he said I was blamed for doing something that I didn't do. And he said I was disciplined for this. He said I knew I wasn't guilty, but they insisted I was guilty. And he said I was taken and laid over a flat surface like a table. And he says they stripped me down to the waist and they took my arms and they tied me down. And he said the disciplinarian took a whip and he beat my back and he whipped my back and he beat my back. And he said he whipped me so hard and for so long that the man who beat me just about collapsed on the floor. He was so tired from beating me. He said I never cried out once. And he said the blood was coming out of my back and I knew it, I could feel it. He said I got up from that place and he said I left school that night. He said I went into the world and decided to make a living. He said it came very easy for me for some strange reason, but I made a living. He proceeded to tell me some more of the story of his life, and believe me, he had so many, many problems. My heart just bled the whole time he told me the story of his life. I said, look, I said, you have told me as well that you are Catholic by denomination, and I said, up here on the Mount, there's some beautiful charismatic masses. I said, I have been enjoying them myself, and I'm a Protestant, you know. But I said, you probably enjoy going up there and having a time of fellowship. And I said, I'm sure that it would help to refresh your spirit and give you a new lease on life and so on. He said, well, I've come up here to the Mount to rest for a few days myself. But he says, all right. He says, I'll go up next day. I finished talking with him. We excused myself and went on to my room. And the next day, I didn't see him. There were so many people up there at the Mount, but nonetheless, I came back again for my supper hour and for my evening, because I was now finished that seminar for the whole 2 weeks. And after I got through the meetings, I came down into the building and sat down at the table again, and hoping to sit by myself, and what should happen? the same man came in the door, and he saw me there, and he says, "Do you mind if I come and sit down here with you?" And I says, "No, that's fine. Be my guest, you know." And again he began to pour his heart out to me. Now the abbot was supposed to come and join me at the end of the session because Babsy was going to take me down back to her place again that night because now the seminars are over. So he was coming to have a meeting with me, and then I was going to go on back home. He came in right at the time that we were having dessert. And so the man, as I say, was continually telling me a few more of the story of his life. I got up to leave, and I said, "Look, I want to thank you so much for the time that we've had together." And after I had introduced the abbot, they'd been sitting and talking for a few minutes, and I said, "Look, we're going to have to excuse ourselves because we do have a meeting, but I'd love to hear from you again. And I just pray the Lord will bless your life." And he says, "Well, just before you go, Mary," he said, I have something here for you I would like to give you." And it was an envelope, and it seemed to be a very fat envelope. Now, I've been used to getting fat envelopes before. A lot of people like to write down their problems on letters, and they hand them to me, and sometimes I've gotten 12-page letters. People like to pour themselves out, you know, on paper. And I read them and then try to answer them according to the wisdom that God gives. Well, I said thank you very much, and I said I would like to answer this letter, and would you put your name and address on the front of it, and I would be more than glad to answer it. And he did, and so I took it and stuffed it in my purse. I often do this. I don't just, you know, see a letter right away. I put it in my purse. Sometimes I even forget about some of these letters. I've got a holy forgetfulness, and maybe 2 or 3 days later I might even find the letter there that I didn't see. And it's not that I'm not caring, believe me, I do, but sometimes we get very busy. And so we went up to the top, and we were sitting up there at the top of the mount, and the abbot and I were talking. Now, ordinarily, as I say, I never open envelopes, but this envelope started to burn a hole in my purse. And the more I kept trying to keep my mind and thoughts on what the abbot was saying, the more I was wanting to find out what was in that letter. So I said, "Father, would you hold it just a minute?" I said, "I've got to see what's in this envelope." So I pulled it out, and I flipped it open. And I looked, and I said, "Father, there's a $100 bill here." And I took the $100 bill and flipped it back. And I says, "There's a second one, and a third one, and a fourth, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 $100 bills. Whew! I've never received a gift like this before. Now immediately, the very first thing that flashed through my mind was, what will I do with it? And I thought, well, now let me see. All my needs are met back home. My rent's paid. All the bills are paid. I don't have anything else that I need to have this money for. I hadn't stopped long enough to think, well, gee, I could stash it in the bank, and use it another day. But as long as my needs were met, that was all that was necessary. And the abbot says, "Mary, what are you going to do with the money?" Now, immediately flashed through my mind the conversation that I had had with Babsy in the car. "Babsy, God is going to provide a man with a large sum of money, and it's going to go into the repairs of your house." And I said to the abbot, "Father, I'm going to give it to Babsy." And he says, "You're going to do what?" So I proceeded to tell him the story of the conversation that we had had. Now, he says, "Look, she's coming to pick us up tonight, and I want this to be verified to you." I says, "As she comes up, I want you to ask her the story that I have told you." Well, he did. And he said to her, "Tell me the story." And she says, "Well, why?" He says, "Well, Mary's got $2,000 here for you." Now, if you knew Babsy and this great big grin that she gets and her eyes sparkling, she says, "Can't I leave you two alone together without you getting into trouble?" back next time, I'd like to tell you the rest of this story.